The lantern burned every night without fail, a single amber eye staring out across the Kansas prairie, and Albert Blackwell had been watching it from the ridge for 364 days before he finally found the courage to ride toward it. He had first noticed the light in the autumn of 1873, when the grasslands had gone the color of old wheat, and the wind carried the first bite of a coming winter. He had been riding the fence line of the Callaway Ranch, where he worked as a hired hand, when the glow appeared on the far side of Dutchman's Creek, steady and small as a fallen star. He had pulled his horse to a stop and sat there in the saddle, watching it, wondering who on God's earth was living out on that stretch of land. As far as he knew, the old Hawkins homestead had been empty since Thomas Hawkins died of a fever the previous spring. Word in town was that the widow had packed up and gone back east to her family in Ohio. Apparently, word in town was wrong. He watched the light for a long while that first night, long enough that his horse, a dark bay gelding named Calhoun, grew impatient and shifted beneath him. Albert finally turned the horse and rode back toward the Callaway bunkhouse, telling himself the light was none of his business. He was a man who had made a quiet practice of minding his own affairs. He had come to Hays City, Kansas, from Missouri 2 years prior with $43 in his pocket, a good horse, and a talent for hard work. He had no reputation for trouble, no reputation for much of anything, which suited him perfectly well. But the next evening, without quite meaning to, he found himself back on the ridge. The lantern was burning. He watched it until the cold drove him home. This became his habit. Night after night, through the autumn and then through the brutal winter of 1873 into 1874, the light appeared in the window of the Hawkins homestead, and Albert appeared on the ridge above Dutchman's Creek. He told himself different things at different times to explain why he kept going back. He told himself it was just a landmark he used to check his bearings. He told himself he was keeping watch out of a neighborly concern, making sure no drifters had taken up in an empty house. He told himself it was simply something to look at during the long, featureless evenings on the Kansas plain. He never told himself the truth, which was simpler and more frightening than any of those explanations. He watched the light because it made him feel something he had not felt in a very long time. It made him feel like something out there in the dark was worth riding toward. But riding toward it was a different thing entirely. To ride toward it, he would have to knock on a door and introduce himself to a stranger. He would have to find words, and words had never come easily to Albert Blackwell. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, and according to the women of Hays City who occasionally remarked upon him, handsome in a weather-worn sort of way, though he would not have believed it if anyone had told him so directly. He had deep brown eyes and a jaw that had been broken once in a fight he had not started and had healed slightly crooked, and his hands were the hands of a man who had worked outdoors for every year of his adult life. He was not, as he saw himself, a man who knocked on widows' doors in the evening. So he watched the light, and the seasons turned. Winter deepened, and the snow came in great white sheets across the open prairie. Albert watched the lantern burn against the white dark of the blizzard nights and marveled at it. Whoever was in that house was not leaving. Spring came and the creek ran high and wild with snowmelt, and still the light appeared every night at the same hour, patient and steady as a heartbeat. Through the summer heat, through the lightning storms that rolled across the Kansas sky like the wrath of something enormous, through the grasshopper plague of that July that stripped the fields bare and drove more than a few families off their land altogether, the lantern burned. Albert watched and wondered and did not ride down. He learned things about the person tending that light in the way that a man who watches carefully learns things from a distance. The lantern always appeared in the same window, the south-facing one, which meant whoever lit it was doing so deliberately, placing it where it could be seen from outside. He noticed, in the winter mornings, a single trail of footprints leading from the house to the barn and back again, always only one set. He noticed the garden that sprang up behind the house in April, which was tended with obvious care. He noticed that the smoke from the chimney told a story of meals cooked at regular hours, of wood brought in and fires built, and life maintained with stubborn consistency. He noticed, once in early June, a figure standing at the corner of the house looking up at the ridge where he sat, and he had felt his heart knock hard against his ribs even though he was a quarter-mile away, and the figure could not have seen him clearly. That was when he understood that the person down there was a woman. He knew it in the way she stood, one hand raised to shade her eyes, her posture carrying some quality of watchfulness that was different from how a man stands. He sat very still on Calhoun until she turned and went back inside, and then he rode home with his heart still hammering and his thoughts in more disorder than he could comfortably manage. He mentioned, carefully, to Bill Garrett, the foreman of the Callaway Ranch, that he had seen lights on at the old Hawkins place. Bill Garrett, a man of 50 with a face like cured leather and no patience for circumlocution, squinted at him and said that Irene Hawkins had stayed, that she had not gone to Ohio after all, that she had buried her husband, Thomas, and then gone right back to work the land by herself, which was either the bravest thing Bill had ever heard of or the stubbornest, and he had not yet decided which. She had been out there alone since the previous April, more than a year now, Bill said, and she had not asked anyone for a thing. Irene Hawkins. Albert turned the name over in his mind that night like a smooth stone in a palm. He was on the ridge again that evening, as he always was, when the lantern appeared in the south window. He sat with Calhoun and the wide Kansas sky and the smell of late summer grass, and thought about a woman named Irene Hawkins who had stayed when everyone expected her to leave, who burned her lantern every night whether anyone was watching or not, who tended her garden and fed her animals and kept her life going with a steadiness that struck him, from his ridge, as the finest thing he had ever observed from a distance. He made up his mind. He would ride down the following morning. In the morning, when it was bright and ordinary, and there was nothing romantic or presumptuous about paying a neighborly call on someone who had been working alone for over a year. In the morning, with something useful to offer, a good reason for being there. He would ride down and introduce himself and ask if there was something a neighbor could do to help, and he would be perfectly ordinary about it. He did not ride down the following morning. He came up with reasons not to. The Callaway Ranch had a broken fence that needed mending along the north pasture. He had promised Bill Garrett he would ride into Hays City for supplies. The weather looked uncertain. None of these reasons were adequate, and he knew it. What stopped him was simpler and more honest than any of them. He was afraid that when he met her, when the mystery of the lantern and the distant figure and the name Irene Hawkins became a real woman standing in a real doorway, something precious would be lost. He had spent a year giving his heart, in quiet and cautious installments, to the idea of her. He was terrified that the reality might not match the ache. But on the 364th night, something changed. He rode to the ridge as always, as the evening light failed and the first stars appeared, and he looked down at the homestead and the lantern came on in the south window as it always did, and he sat there as he always did. And then, from somewhere east of the homestead, a sound carried across the quiet. Raised voices, men's voices, 2 or 3 of them, coming from the direction of the road that ran along the creek. He sat forward in the saddle and watched. He could see, in the failing light, horses and riders stopping at the gate of the Hawkins property. He watched the front door of the house open, the lantern's light spilling out briefly, and a figure in the doorway, and the riders at the gate, and something about the whole arrangement made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He put his heels to Calhoun and rode down off the ridge for the first time in a year. He did not know exactly what he was riding toward. He knew only that the lantern burned, and a woman was standing in her doorway, and there were 3 men on horses at her gate, and something in the set of the world at that moment required him to be there. He crossed Dutchman's Creek at the ford, the water cold and fast around Calhoun's legs, and came up the other bank and rode toward the homestead at a steady lope, and the voices became clearer as he drew close. "We are telling you, Mrs. Hawkins, that Callum Driscoll intends to file on this land come Monday," one of the men was saying. He had a flat, mean voice, the voice of a man comfortable delivering bad news on someone else's behalf. "You have not got a clear deed without your husband's name on the filing, and Mr. Driscoll is prepared to argue that before the county recorder." "I have a deed," said the woman in the doorway. Her voice was steady and clear and not loud, the voice of a person who did not raise their voice unless they meant to be heard from a considerable distance. "Thomas Hawkins filed that deed in 1871, and it lists this land as joint property of Thomas and Irene Hawkins. I suggest Mr. Driscoll consult an attorney before he embarrasses himself. There is a question about the validity of joint filing under the Homestead Act in this county, ma'am. Mr. Driscoll has friends in the county recorder's office who are prepared to." Albert rode up to the gate at a deliberate pace and stopped Calhoun there, and the three men on horses turned to look at him. They were the type he recognized immediately, not cowboys, not ranchers, not men who worked land themselves. They were the kind of men that men like Callum Driscoll kept around for the purpose of delivering messages that sounded like threats. Albert had met the type before. "Evening," he said. He kept his voice level and easy the way he kept his hands easy and visible. "This is a private conversation," the flat-voiced man said. "I am sure it is," Albert said. "I am Albert Blackwell. I work for George Calloway, and I am a neighbor of Mrs. Hawkins. I thought I would stop in and see if everything was all right." He let his eyes move from the men to the woman in the doorway, and he got his first look at Irene Hawkins. She was perhaps 28 years old, with dark auburn hair that was pinned up but coming loose in places from a day of work, and she was wearing a plain gray dress covered by an apron she had not thought to remove when she came to the door. She had a lean, strong-boned face with dark eyes and a mouth that was pressed into a firm line, and she was gripping the door frame with one hand in a way that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but something that combined both into something fiercer than either. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read. "I am quite fine, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "These gentlemen were just leaving." The flat-voiced man looked at Albert, taking his measure. Albert looked back at him with the relaxed attention of a man who has nothing in particular to prove and nowhere else to be. After a moment, the man pulled his horse around. "Tell Mr. Driscoll I have received his message," Irene said from the doorway. "Tell him my answer is no, and it will remain no, and if he files against my deed, I will have an attorney from Hays City in that recorder's office before noon." The three men rode away down the creek road without another word. Albert watched them go until they were shapes in the dark and then not shapes at all. He turned back to the house. Irene Hawkins was still in the doorway looking at him, and he became acutely aware that he had arrived at her door on impulse after watching her light for a year, and he had not thought of a single thing to say. "I am sorry to intrude, Mrs. Hawkins," he said. "I heard voices from the ridge and I was concerned." "The ridge," she said. There was something in the way she said it that made him wonder what she had seen from her doorway over the past year, and whether she had seen more than he thought. "I ride the Calloway fence line most evenings," he said, which was true as far as it went. She considered him for a moment. "Would you like to come in, Mr. Blackwell? I have coffee on." He tied Calhoun to the fence post and went inside. The interior of the Hawkins homestead was small and extremely neat, the kind of neatness that speaks not of someone fussy by nature, but of someone who keeps order because order is what stands between them and the chaos outside. There was an iron stove and a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner, a shelf of books, a cabinet with a few pieces of china, and in the south window, the lantern. Up close it was an ordinary kerosene lantern, the kind anyone might have, with a glass chimney slightly blackened from use. He sat at the table and she poured coffee into a tin cup and set it in front of him and poured one for herself and sat down across from him. "I know who you are," she said without preamble. "You work for Calloway. You ride that ridge most evenings. I have seen you up there more than once." His face went warm in a way he was grateful was probably not visible in the lantern light. "I apologize, Mrs. Hawkins, if that has been. I put the lantern in the window," she said. She said it simply, looking at him with those dark, direct eyes. "When Thomas died and everyone expected me to leave and I decided to stay, I was not stupid about it. I knew I was alone out here. I put the lantern in the south window every night so that if anyone was passing on the ridge or along the creek road, they would know there was a person alive in this house, that if there was trouble, someone would see it." She paused and wrapped both hands around her cup. "I had seen you up there by November. I was glad of it." Albert held his coffee cup and looked at this woman who had just told him in the most direct terms that she had known he was watching and had not minded it, and he felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for a long time. "I should have come down sooner," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." The silence between them then was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of two people sitting with a truth that has been said out loud for the first time, and finding that the air after it is easier to breathe than the air before. "Who is Callum Driscoll?" he asked. She set her cup down and folded her hands on the table and told him. Callum Driscoll was a land speculator out of Wichita who had been moving through this part of Kansas for 2 years, buying up homesteads from families who had been broken by drought, grasshoppers, and bad luck, and filing on abandoned properties. He had tried to purchase Thomas's claim the year before Thomas died, when the fever had taken Thomas and left him too weak to work the fields, and Thomas had refused him. Now Driscoll was circling back, apparently under the impression that a widow alone could be pressured more easily than a sick man had been. "He is wrong about the deed," she said. "The joint filing is valid. Thomas was very careful about it. He knew even then that there might come a time when the land would need to be in both our names." Her voice remained steady, but something moved briefly across her face, a shadow of grief, the kind that a person who has been living alone and working hard has learned to keep moving, because stopping for it is a luxury the Prairie does not allow. "You need a good attorney," Albert said. "Tom Reeve in Hays City is honest. He has handled homestead cases before." "I have very little money to pay an attorney," she said, with the directness of someone who considers poverty a fact to be named rather than a shame to be hidden. "Tom Reeve has a sliding rate," Albert said. "If you can show him the deed and the original filing certificate, he will take one look at what Driscoll is attempting and he will want to take the case on principle alone. He does not like Driscoll. Several people have come to Tom Reeve about Driscoll over the past 2 years, and he has a particular feeling about the man." She studied him for a moment. "You seem to know a great deal about local affairs, Mr. Blackwell." "I have been in Hays City for 2 years, and I am a quiet man," he said. "Quiet men hear a great deal." That earned him something extraordinary. She smiled. It was a small, real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, and it changed her entire face, and Albert Blackwell sat very still for a moment because he understood with sudden, disorienting clarity that the ache he had felt on the ridge for a year was not going to diminish now that he was close to her. It was going to become considerably worse. He stayed for 2 cups of coffee and left before 10 o'clock, which was the reasonable and appropriate thing to do, and he rode home under the stars with Calhoun moving at a comfortable walk, and his whole chest full of something he did not yet have a name for. He was at her gate at 8 o'clock the following morning. She opened the door before he had finished tying Calhoun to the post, which meant she had seen him coming across the flat, and she was wearing a different dress, a dark blue one that fit her well, and her hair was pinned up more neatly than it had been the night before. He noticed these things and said nothing about them. "I spoke to Tom Reeve," he said, coming up the path. "Early this morning. He would like to see you and the deed at your earliest convenience. He says what Driscoll is attempting is legally shaky at best and fraudulent at worst, and those are his words exactly." She stood in the doorway and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, a kind of careful assessment, as if she were measuring the distance between what he said and what he meant and finding it smaller than she was accustomed to. "You rode to Hayes City and back before 8 o'clock in the morning." "I was up early," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Come in, Mr. Blackwell. I will get the deed." He sat at the same table and drank the same good coffee, while she retrieved a wooden document box from under the bed, and he watched her go through papers with the methodical care of a woman who understood that paper was a form of armor in this world, and that a deed in a box under a bed was sometimes the only thing standing between a person and being put off the land they had broken their body to build. She found the original filing certificate, the deed, a letter from the county recorder's office from 1871, and a handwritten letter from Thomas Hawkins, evidently composed during his illness, laying out the details of the property's legal history with great specificity. She spread these on the table and Albert looked at them, not because he had any great legal knowledge, but because she was showing them to him, and he understood that this was an act of trust on her part, and trust from Irene Hawkins was not a thing to be taken lightly. "Thomas was a careful man," she said, touching the corner of the handwritten letter. "It is clear he was," Albert said. "He did not expect to die at 34, she said. "Nobody does, I suppose, but he was careful anyway. He used to say that the land would outlast him, so he might as well make sure it knew who it belonged to." Albert looked at the letter in her husband's neat, deliberate handwriting and felt, quite suddenly and unexpectedly, a deep respect for a man he had never met. Thomas Hawkins had known somehow that this woman would need protecting after he was gone, and he had done what he could from a sickbed to provide it. "Let me drive you to Hayes City," Albert said. "Tom Reeve can see you today if you go this morning." She looked at him steadily. "You have work at Calloway's. I have spoken to Bill Garrett. He will manage without me for a morning." She was quiet again for a moment, and he could see her deciding something. It was not, he thought, that she was deciding whether to trust him. She had decided that already in some essential way, or she would not have shown him the documents. What she was deciding was something harder, whether to let someone help her. A year alone had built walls that were also, in some ways, a kind of pride, and letting them down, even for something as practical as a wagon ride to a lawyer's office, cost her something. "All right," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." They drove to Hayes City in Albert's wagon, which he had borrowed from the Calloway ranch, along with a second horse to pair with Cowhound, and the drive took the better part of an hour across the open flat, and then down the road into town. They did not talk for the first part of the drive, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silences are between people who are getting used to each other. The Kansas morning was enormous and blue overhead, and the late September grasses moved in long, silver waves across the plain, and Irene Hawkins sat beside him on the wagon seat with the document box in her lap and looked out at the land with an expression that he had seen before, on the faces of people who have chosen something difficult and do not regret it. "How long have you been working for Calloway?" she asked after a while. 2 years, since I came from Missouri." "What is in Missouri?" "My family," he said. "My parents and 2 brothers. I left because there was not enough work for 3 sons on one farm, and Missouri felt small to me. I wanted to see what the country looked like to the west." "And what does it look like?" He considered the question seriously. "Large," he said. "Terrifying, beautiful." She laughed, a short, genuine sound. "That is a very accurate description." "What about you?" he asked. "Were you born in Kansas?" "No, Ohio. I came out with Thomas in 1869 when the Homestead Act was drawing people west. We were 24, both of us, and we thought the hardest part would be the journey." She paused. "The journey was not the hardest part." "No," he said. "I imagine it was not." They drove on through the morning, and she told him about the first years on the homestead, the breaking of the ground which Thomas had done with a rented ox, and a stubborn tenacity that had left him exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, the first crop of corn that had failed in a dry year, and the second that had succeeded beyond their hopes, the building of the barn, the first good winter with the root cellar full and the animals housed, and the snow outside making everything white and still and quiet. She spoke about Thomas without flinching, and Albert listened without flinching, because there was nothing strange or painful to him about hearing a woman speak of a man she had loved. The strangeness would have been if she could not. Tom Reeves' office was on the main street of Hays City, above the dry goods store. He was a small, tidy man of 55 with spectacles and a precise manner that concealed a considerable combativeness where legal injustice was involved. He reviewed Irene's documents for 20 minutes while they waited, occasionally making small sounds of satisfaction, and then he looked up and said that the deed was absolutely valid, that Callum Driscoll's claim was legally groundless, and that he would be delighted to represent her for a fee of $10 up front, and 20 more if the matter went to formal proceedings, which he doubted it would once Driscoll's attorney understood the quality of the documentation. Irene paid the $10 from a small purse, with the composure of a woman spending money she could not easily spare, but which she judged to be necessary. Tom Reeves shook her hand and said he would have a letter in Driscoll's attorney's hands by Friday, and that she should not expect any more evening visitors. They were back on the wagon and heading out of Hays City before noon. The sense of relief in Irene was visible, though she carried it quietly, a slight loosening in the set of her shoulders, a somewhat easier angle to her chin. "Thank you," she said, as they cleared the edge of town, "for coming down last night and for this morning. You did not have to do either." "I wanted to," he said. She looked at him sidelong, and there was that measuring look again, and something else now, something warmer and more uncertain. "You are a puzzle to me, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "In what way? You are a man who watches from a distance for a very long time and then arrives at precisely the right moment," she said. "I do not know whether to find that mysterious or simply very well timed." He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but a warmth had risen in his face that he could not entirely suppress. "I would settle for well timed," he said. She smiled and looked back at the road, and they drove the rest of the way in a silence that had become, over the course of the morning, one of the most comfortable silences Albert Blackwell had ever sat inside. He came back the following Saturday with a load of fence posts in the wagon. He had noticed from the ridge that the eastern fence line of her property had 3 posts down, which in cattle country was an invitation to trouble, because if a neighboring rancher's cattle wandered onto a homesteader's crop, the responsibility for the damage fell to the homesteader whose fence was down, by the informal law of the open range that still prevailed in many parts of Kansas, despite the encroachment of homesteaders and the bitter disputes that had followed. He had not asked her permission to bring the fence posts. He had brought them because they were needed and he had them, and if she told him to take them away again, he would take them away, but he thought she would not. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon and stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the posts in the wagon bed and then at him. "I noticed the east fence," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that walked the fine line between gratitude and stubbornness, and then she said, "Do you know how to set a post properly?" "Because the last man who offered to help me with fencing did it wrong, and every post he set was pulling out by spring." "I know how to set a fence post," he said. "All right," she said. "I will help." They spent the morning setting fence posts together, which was good hard work that required 2 people, one to hold and one to tamp, and they worked with the easy efficiency of people who are both competent and who have, without discussion, found a working rhythm together. The October air was crisp and bright, and the light on the prairie had that particular quality of the Kansas autumn, slanted and golden and full of clarity, as if the air itself were being purified for the coming cold. She worked hard. He had known this, in a theoretical way, from watching the evidence of her labor from the ridge, but to see it up close was different. She did not make it look easy, and she did not pretend it was easy, but she did it with a matter-of-fact competence that he found he admired enormously. She hauled and tamped and did not complain, and when they stopped at midday, she produced a lunch of bread and salt pork and pickled vegetables from the root cellar that tasted, to Albert, like the best meal he had eaten in recent memory. though he suspected this had more to do with the company than the cooking. They sat on the flat top of the fence rail and ate and looked out across the prairie, and the horses grazed nearby, and the world was very quiet and very large around them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you stay in Kansas? You said you came to see what the country looked like to the west. Kansas is not as far west as a man can go." He thought about it honestly. "I stopped," he said, "because I found work and the work was good and the land was good. And because I had been moving for a while, and it is not the motion that matters in the end, I think, but the stopping, finding a place worth stopping for." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the grasses. "Thomas used to say that the prairie was not beautiful the way people back east said land should be beautiful. He said it was beautiful the way a hard truth is beautiful. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is." "He was right," Albert said. She turned and looked at him. They were sitting close together on the fence rail, the way that two people who have been working side by side naturally end up, with the comfortable proximity of shared labor, and her dark eyes were level with his, and the October light was in her hair where it was coming loose at the temple. And Albert felt the full weight of the year he had spent on the ridge pressing forward, all that accumulated longing looking for somewhere to land. He did not say anything. He was afraid to say anything, because the words felt enormous and the moment felt fragile, and he was a man who had learned to move carefully with fragile things. "You should come to dinner on Sunday," she said, "if you are not otherwise engaged." "I am not otherwise engaged," he said. He came to dinner Sunday, and then the following Sunday and the one after that, and through October and into November a pattern established itself as naturally as if it had always existed. He came on Saturdays to help with the larger work, the repairs and the winterizing that a homestead required, and that were twice as hard for one person as for two. He came on Sundays for dinner and stayed into the evening. In between, if the ranch work took him past the ridge in the late afternoon, he would occasionally ride down and stop in for an hour, and she would have coffee on and they would sit at the table and talk. They talked about everything. He told her about Missouri and about his father, a serious, quiet man who had farmed all his life and died young of the slow exhaustion that farming a marginal piece of land in a difficult state will eventually produce in a man, and about his mother, who was still alive and writing him letters that he answered with the faithful regularity of a man who understood how much a letter means when you are the one left behind. She told him about Ohio, about the large, comfortable family she had come from, about how coming west with Thomas had been the first truly bold thing she had ever done, and how she had been terrified the whole journey and had not told Thomas, because he was excited and she loved him for his excitement and did not want to diminish it. She told him about Thomas's illness, speaking of it with the measured calm of a woman who has been through the worst of the grief and come out the other side, not undamaged, but upright. Thomas had been sick for 5 months. She had nursed him and worked the farm as well as she was able and written to her family in Ohio asking for help, and her family had written back encouraging her to come home, and she had understood then, reading those letters, that home was no longer Ohio. Home was this piece of Kansas ground, this hard-won, broken-in, beautiful, difficult place, and she was not leaving it. "I was not sure I could do it," she said one November evening, the stove warm against the early cold outside, the lantern burning on the table between them. "When Thomas died and it was just me and the winter coming, I was not sure I was strong enough." "You were," he said. "I was more frightened than you would believe for the first few months," she said. "I put the lantern in the window partly to signal that someone was alive in here and partly because the dark was very large and the lamp made it smaller." She looked at the flame for a moment. "After a while I stopped being frightened and it became a habit, something I did because it meant something to me, even if no one saw it." "I saw it," he said. His voice was quieter than he intended. She raised her eyes to his. The stove ticked in the silence. "I know you did," she said. He leaned forward and said carefully, "Irene." He had begun calling her by her first name 3 weeks earlier, and she had begun calling him Albert, and his name in her voice was still a thing he had not entirely adjusted to. "I want to say something and I want to say it right, so if I take a moment with it, I hope you will be patient." "I am patient," she said, and the corners of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "I have been on that ridge more evenings than I can count," he said, "and I have thought more about you than is probably the behavior of a sensible person, and I have been here nearly every Saturday and Sunday for 2 months, and I want to be here for every Saturday and Sunday after this. Not to help with fences, though I am happy to help with fences, because you are the finest person I have encountered in my life, and being near you is the thing I most want to do." He stopped. "That is what I wanted to say." Irene Hawkins looked at him across the lantern on the table for a long moment with those dark eyes that never seemed to shy away from anything, and he had the feeling of being read very thoroughly and very honestly, the way a good land survey reads a piece of ground. "Albert," she said, "I have been hoping you would say something like that since approximately the second week of October." He laughed. It came out of him like something that had been pent up, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and she laughed too, and the sound of it in that small, warm room on the November prairie was one of the finest sounds he had ever heard. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that for a while, not saying much, the lantern burning steadily between them. He began to speak to Bill Garrett about his plans. Bill Garrett, who was a man of deep practical intelligence disguised as bluntness, listened to Albert describe his situation and then said, "You've been mooning over that Hawkins woman for a year. Are you going to do something about it or not?" Albert said he intended to do something about it. Bill Garrett said that the Callaway Ranch had a piece of land, 40 acres to the south of the main property, that George Callaway had been meaning to sell for 2 years and hadn't gotten around to. It was good land with water access from the creek, and if Albert was serious about setting himself up independently, Bill thought Callaway might sell it reasonably. He also said, with more gentleness than his usual tone admitted, that Albert was a good man and he hoped things worked out, and then he went back to being the abrupt, weathered foreman that the situation required. Albert spoke to George Callaway, who was a fair man, and agreed to sell the 40 acres on terms that Albert could manage, spread over 3 years. They shook on it in December of 1874. He told Irene about the land on a Sunday, sitting at her table, and watched her face go through a complex series of expressions, ending in something luminous. "That is just across the creek from me," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is correct." "Albert," she said, with a precision that told him she was feeling more than she was presently prepared to show, "what exactly are you proposing?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said what he had been working up to saying since October, what he had known since the first evening at this table that he was working up to, what had been true in some essential way since the night he sat on the ridge and could not stand watching any more and rode down. "I am proposing that I build a house on that 40 acres, and that when it is built, and when it is ready, you do me the honor of marrying me and living in it, if you are willing." She was looking at him with her hands folded on the table and her chin lifted and those dark eyes absolutely clear, and she said, "I have 40 acres of my own." "You do," he said, "and a house already." "You do," he said, "a good one. So the practical argument for marrying you is not entirely obvious," she said. "No," he said, "it is not a practical argument. It is that I love you, Irene, and I would like to spend my life beside you if you will have me." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, Albert, I will have you." He crossed the distance between his chair and hers, which was not a very large distance, and she stood as he came, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and the lantern burned on the table, and the winter wind moved against the house, and neither of them paid either of those things any attention. They were married in March of 1875 at the small Presbyterian church in Hays City, on a day when the Kansas sky was the particular pale blue of early spring, and the mud of the thaw had dried just enough to be manageable. Tom Reeve attended, and so did Bill Garrett, who wore a clean shirt and looked somewhat uncomfortable in it but shook Albert's hand with evident warmth. 3 women from the neighboring homestead to the north, the Pearson family, came to wish Irene well and brought a gift of a quilt they had sewn together over the winter, in a pattern of blue and gold that Irene later said she thought of as the colors of the Kansas spring. Albert's mother could not make the journey from Missouri, but she sent a letter that Irene read and wept over slightly, and then folded carefully and put in the document box alongside the deed and the legal papers from Tom Reeve's office. The question of the 2 properties and how to work them had been a practical matter they had discussed over the winter with the thoroughness that 2 competent people bring to a genuine problem. Irene would not give up her land. This was not in question. The homestead was hers, and she had earned it at a cost that was not only financial, and Albert would no more have asked her to relinquish it than he would have asked her to stop breathing. The decision they reached was this. Albert's 40 acres, which was adjacent to hers and shared the creek water, would be combined with her homestead into a single working unit. Albert would sell his interest in the 40 acres eventually and invest the proceeds in the joint operation, or they would farm both pieces together, depending on how things developed. Tom Reeve drew up the documentation to make it clean and legal, and Albert signed without hesitation, and Irene looked at him when he signed with an expression he had come to recognize as her face when she was moved by something and was working to keep it contained. The first spring of their marriage was a revelation to Albert, who had observed Irene's competence from a distance and then from a closer proximity, but who had not yet seen what she could do when there were 2 of them, when the weight of everything was not falling on one pair of hands. She had been good alone. Together, they were extraordinary. The garden went in earlier and larger. The fields were planted with more acreage than she had managed alone. He deferred to her on the crops, because she had 4 years of hard-won knowledge of this specific piece of ground, what it could hold, and what it needed, and how it responded to the particular rhythms of the Kansas weather. And he brought his own skills in the animal husbandry, and the building, and the kind of systematic physical labor that a big, strong man in good health can provide in quantities that make an enormous difference. She lit the lantern every night still. He did not ask her to stop, and she did not stop, and on the evenings when he was out late checking on the animals or riding the fence line, the lantern in the south window guided him home across the dark prairie the way it had guided him down from the ridge that September night a year and a half before. It had become, he thought, a kind of language between them. The lantern said, "I am here, the house is warm, there is someone waiting." And he would see it from wherever he was, and something in him would ease, and he would turn toward it. The trouble with Callum Driscoll was resolved more quickly than they had dared hope. Tom Reeve's letter reached Driscoll's attorney in Wichita in early October of 1874, and Driscoll made one further attempt at intimidation through a formal letter to the county recorder, which Tom Reeve countered with a detailed legal brief that the county recorder, who was not, apparently, as thoroughly in Driscoll's pocket as those evening messengers had implied, accepted with relief. The matter was officially closed before Christmas. Irene received the notification and read it at the table with a composure that did not quite conceal her relief, and then she looked up at Albert and said, Thomas would be satisfied, and he understood that this was the highest praise she could think of for any outcome. The summer of 1875 was good. Not easy, nothing was easy on the Kansas prairie, but good. The corn came in well. The vegetable garden produced with an abundance that filled the root cellar to capacity and left enough to sell in Hays City. Albert had bought a milk cow in the spring and a second draft horse, and the farm was beginning to feel like a going concern rather than a daily act of survival. In the evenings, he and Irene would sit on the steps of the house as the sun went down and the sky turned its improbable Kansas colors, orange and purple and deep red, and the grassland went silver and then gray and then dark, and the first stars appeared, and it was nothing like the ridge and everything like it at the same time. In August, on a particularly fine evening, she told him she was expecting. She said it directly, as she said everything, looking at him with that clear, level gaze, and he sat very still for a moment with the warm evening around him, and then he reached for her hand and held it and said, "Good." And she laughed at that, the short, genuine laugh he loved, and said, "Good is exactly the right word." Their son was born in April of 1876, on a morning when a late spring storm was moving across the prairie from the northwest, the sky turning green-gray in the way that Kansas skies do before something serious arrives. Mrs. Pearson from the neighboring homestead came to help, and Albert was in the barn with the horses, because Mrs. Pearson had told him clearly that he was to go to the barn and not come back until he was sent for, and he did as he was told, and he spent 3 of the longest hours of his life in the barn with the horses and the sound of the wind building outside. Mrs. Pearson came to the barn door and told him he had a son and that everything was well, and Albert Blackwell sat down on a hay bale and put his face in his hands for a moment, not from grief, but from the particular overwhelming pressure of an enormous relief, and then he stood up and went inside. The baby was wrapped in a piece of the blue and gold quilt that the Pearson women had made, and Irene was propped against the pillows with the exhausted, luminous expression of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and knows it, and the boy was small and red-faced and entirely outraged about the circumstances in which he found himself. "He has your jaw," Irene said. "My jaw was broken," Albert said. "His look's fine," she said. They named him Thomas Albert Blackwell, Thomas for her first husband, whose careful paperwork had saved this land and whose steady love had made Irene into the woman she was, and Albert for himself. It seemed right to Albert, who had never been a man to begrudge the dead their place in the story. The years moved. Thomas was a loud, energetic child who took to the land the way some children take to the water, instinctively and joyfully, and who could be found at 3 years old attempting to assist with whatever work was happening, with more enthusiasm than effectiveness, but with a persistence that both his parents recognized. Bill Garrett, who came to visit occasionally on Sunday afternoons, said that the boy had his mother's stubbornness, and Irene said she would take that as a compliment. In 1878, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara June, and she was quieter than Thomas and more observant, and seemed from the earliest age to be cataloging the world with careful interest. Albert wrote to his mother in Missouri about each child's birth, and his mother wrote back letters full of joy and advice, and in the summer of 1879, she made the journey west by train to Hays City, old and a little frail but entirely herself, and she sat in the kitchen of the homestead and held Clara June and watched Thomas run in the yard, and talked to Irene for most of 2 days and told Albert before she left that he had done well, which from his mother, who had a high standard for what well meant, was the highest possible praise. The homestead continued to grow. The original house had been extended twice, first to add a proper bedroom when Thomas was born and again to add a second bedroom when Clara came. Albert had built a larger barn, had bought more animals, had begun to grow winter wheat in addition to corn, which hedged against the uncertainty of the single-crop approach. The 40 acres he had bought from Callaway were fully integrated into their operation by 1877, and the combined 100 acres, hers and his, was productive enough in good years to provide a genuine surplus. The bad years came too, as they always did on the Kansas plain. There was a drought year in 1880 that took the corn crop and badly damaged the wheat, and required them to spend down the savings they had built up over the good years. And they sat at the table in the September of that year, and looked at the numbers and felt the weight of them. And Irene said that they had been through worse and they had, and Albert said that they would replant, and they did. There was a winter in 1881 that was so severe that the creek froze solid enough to drive a wagon across, which Albert did, to get supplies through to two homesteaders north of them who had been cut off by the snow. One of them was an older man, a widower named Elias Strand, who had been farming alone for 3 years and who was in bad health and clearly not managing well. Albert and Irene discussed it that evening, the lantern burning on the table between them as it always did, and Irene said that someone needed to keep an eye on Elias Strand, and Albert said he would, and he did, riding over twice a week through the rest of the winter to bring wood and check on him. Elias Strand survived the winter and was better by spring, and he and Albert became friends, the quiet, durable kind of friendship that forms between men who have faced serious weather together. In 1882, Tom Reeve sent Albert and Irene a letter informing them that Callum Driscoll had been formally charged with land fraud in Wichita County, based on the documented cases of 3 homesteaders who had been successfully pressured off their land by the same tactics he had attempted on Irene. The trial resulted in a conviction, and Driscoll was barred from land transactions in Kansas. Tom Reeve's letter, characteristically brief, said only that he thought they would like to know, and that justice, while slow, had eventually appeared. Irene read the letter and said, "Good," in exactly the tone that Albert had said good when she told him she was expecting Thomas, and he laughed, and she did too. Albert had been thinking for a while about writing to his brothers in Missouri. He had left under circumstances that were not unfriendly, but that had involved a certain amount of unstated tension, the ordinary friction of 3 young men on one small farm competing for an inheritance that wasn't large enough to make the competition worth it. His older brother, Daniel, had written once or twice over the years, carefully worded letters that contained news without quite reaching for anything. His younger brother, James, had not written at all, which Albert had always understood as the mark of James's particular kind of pride, a pride that would not reach out first. In the summer of 1882, Albert wrote to both of them. He wrote honestly, describing the land and the work and the life he had built, and he said that if either of them were looking for something new, there was room in this part of Kansas for a man who was willing to work, and that he knew people who could help someone get started. Daniel wrote back within a month. He was still in Missouri and likely to stay, but he was glad to hear from Albert and glad things were going well, and he sent his regards to Irene, whose existence Albert had clearly communicated in a previous letter, and asked about the children with the careful warmth of a brother who has been at a distance too long and is trying to close it through paper. James wrote back 6 weeks later in a letter that was brief and slightly belligerent in tone but which contained, embedded in the 4th sentence, the information that he was thinking of coming west in the spring. Albert showed the letter to Irene and she read it and said, "He is coming. He just needs to arrive at it himself." She was right, as she generally was. James Blackwell arrived on an April morning in 1883 on the train to Hays City, carrying a single large bag and the aggressive self-sufficiency of a man who will accept help only if it is offered in a way that does not make him feel helped. Albert met him at the station and they stood on the platform and looked at each other, and then Albert shook his hand and James shook back and said, "You look older," and Albert said, "So do you," and they both knew that was about as much as either of them was going to say about the years. James was 29 that spring, broad like Albert and dark-haired and quick in a way Albert was not, quick with a laugh and quick with a temper and quick with his hands in work. He had a particular talent with horses that was almost immediately apparent, and Bill Garrett, who was still foreman at the Callaway Ranch at the age of 58 and showed no signs of stopping, hired him within 2 weeks of his arrival. James lived at the Callaway bunkhouse and came to Sunday dinner at the homestead with the regularity that the invitation was always open, and he and Thomas, who was 7 that year and fascinated by his newly arrived uncle, became friends in the immediate, uncomplicated way of a child and an adult who share a temperament. The household expanded and contracted through the years in the way that households do on the prairie, where the boundaries between neighbors are somewhat more permeable than in other places, because the land requires a collective generosity to survive. Irene was the kind of woman that other women turned to, not because she sought that role, but because she was competent and honest and did not flinch from hard things. And there were seasons when a neighbor's crisis, a birth that went badly, a husband's injury, a child's illness, brought her work and care beyond the borders of her own farm. Albert saw this and admired it and did not interfere with it, understanding that this was part of who she was, and that a man who loved Irene Hawkins loved this part of her too. He watched her sometimes in the evenings, when she did not know she was being watched. She would be at the table reading, or working on some piece of mending, or writing a letter, and the lamplight would be around her, and Thomas would be asleep in his room and Clara in hers. And the house would be full of the quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, the quiet of a life that has been built with care. And he would stand in the doorway between the main room and the bedroom and look at her and feel, still, after all the years, that ache he had first felt on the ridge. Not the longing kind anymore, because she was here and he was here and this was theirs. The good kind. The kind that means something matters to you more than you can measure. She would look up and catch him watching and say, without any particular surprise, "What are you looking at, Albert Blackwell?" And he would say truthfully, "You." And she would make a small sound that was half exasperation and half something else entirely and go back to her reading, and he would go to bed, and she would come to bed when she was ready, and the prairie would be outside and very large and very full of weather, and they would be in here together, inside everything they had built. In 1884, Thomas was 8 and in the schoolroom that had been established 3 years prior in a converted building on the edge of Hays City, taught by a young woman from Pennsylvania named Miss Abigail Holt, who was 23 and serious and quite good, and Clara was 6 and attending with him. Albert drove them in on Monday mornings and brought them back on Friday afternoons, because the distance was too far for daily travel, and they boarded through the week with a family in town that took in the children of outlying farms. It was one of the costs and one of the losses of the prairie life, that the school days happened away from home, and Irene missed them on the school weeks with a directness she did not bother to hide. It was during one of those school weeks in the fall of 1884, when the house was quiet with the children away, that Albert came in from the barn late in the afternoon and found Irene sitting at the table with a letter in her hands and an expression on her face he recognized as the one she wore when something had genuinely surprised her. "From Ohio," she said. "My sister, Margaret, she is coming west. Coming here. Through here. She and her husband are going on to Colorado where he has business, but they would stop here on the way." She set the letter on the table and looked at it. "I have not seen Margaret in 11 years. He sat down across from her. "How do you feel about that?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was being honest with herself before she was honest with anyone else. "Complicated," she said. "Margaret was the one who kept writing after Thomas died, telling me to come home. She meant it kindly. She was frightened for me, I think, but I always felt, reading those letters, that she did not understand." She paused. "I wonder if she will understand now." "Show her the land," Albert said. "Show her the root cellar and the wheat field and the new barn. Show her Thomas trying to hitch the team by himself. She will understand." Irene looked at him. "You are not always as quiet as you appear," she said. "I am saving it for the important things," he said. She laughed and reached across the table and took his hand. Margaret Holloway, née Hawkins, arrived on a Tuesday in October, thin and brisk, and fashionably dressed relative to what Irene and the women of the Kansas prairie were wearing. And she stood in the yard of the homestead and looked around at the house and the barn and the garden and the flat horizon in every direction, and was very clearly working to form an impression that was not what she had expected. Her husband, Gerald, was a pleasant, vague man who kept looking at the sky as if he expected it to do something alarming. Irene and Margaret sat at the table for most of 2 days the way Albert had imagined they might, and he took Gerald out to see the fields and the animals and gave the sisters the kitchen and the privacy they needed. And in the evenings, all four of them ate together and talked about practical things. And Albert watched Irene and her sister the way he watched everything important, quietly and with full attention. On the second evening, he came in from the barn to find the two women at the table with a bottle of the good rye whiskey he kept for occasions, which he had never told Irene not to help herself to, and they were talking in the way that women talk when they have crossed from the surface things to the real ones, leaning toward each other, their voices low. He took his boots off in the entry and went quietly past to the bedroom and left them to it. When Irene came to bed much later, he was still awake. "She understands now," Irene said, lying down beside him in the dark. "Good," he said. She was quiet for a moment and then she said you seemed like a good man. "That is kind of her. I told her you were the best man I had ever known," she said, very quietly in the dark. He reached for her hand under the quilt and held it. Outside, the prairie was dark and wide and the stars were visible through the window, the same stars that had been over him on the ridge, over her in the house, all those nights before he rode down. He lay there with her hand in his and thought about the lantern in the south window, burning through all the seasons, through the cold and the heat and the storms, patient and steady and true. "Irene," he said. She said, already drifting toward sleep. "I should have ridden down on the first night." She laughed softly in the dark. "You came down at the right moment," she said. "That is all that mattered." He thought about that. He thought about the year on the ridge, the patience of it, the ache of it, the strange and necessary cost of watching from a distance long enough to understand what you were looking toward. And then the moment when something changed and he rode down and everything that followed, the coffee on the table, the documents in the box, the fence posts, the Sundays, the lantern guiding him home across the dark prairie night after night. "Sleep," she said, squeezing his hand. He did. James Blackwell, in the meanwhile, had been building a life of his own with the combination of stubbornness and energy that was his particular gift. By 1885, he had saved enough, working for Callaway and doing additional work on the side, to make an offer on a piece of land south of Hays City, and he did, and spent the following year breaking it and building a modest house on it, and Albert helped him on weekends with the building, the two of them working in a companionable silence that was different from the conversational silence Albert had with Irene, but was its own kind of good. James also, in the summer of 1885, began to be seen frequently in the company of a woman named Ruth Carey, who was 26 and worked in the dry goods store in Hays City and had come originally from Tennessee. She was red-haired and forthright and gave James no quarter whatsoever, which suited him perfectly, and Albert and Irene discussed them on a Sunday afternoon in September of that year with the calm amusement of people who are far enough into their own happiness to find other people's impending happiness purely enjoyable. "She is good for him," Irene said. "She is not afraid of him," Albert said. "Same thing," Irene said. James and Ruth married in the spring of 1886 in the same Presbyterian church where Albert and Irene had married 11 years before, and it was Albert who stood beside his brother at the front of the church, and it was Irene who stood in the second row with Thomas, who was 10 and solemn-faced about the proceedings, and Clara, who was 8 and delighted by the wedding dress. Bill Garrett retired from the Callaway Ranch in the winter of 1886, at the age of 61, and moved into a small house in Hays City that he had purchased with the savings of 40 years of working other people's land. He came to Sunday dinner at the homestead on his first free Sunday and sat at the table with a slightly bewildered expression, the expression of a man who has been occupied every waking minute of his adult life and has suddenly been handed an expanse of unstructured time. Albert said, "What will you do?" Bill Garrett said. "I have no idea," with the tone of a man who has considered this question and found it genuinely unanswerable. Irene said that there was always work on a farm for someone who wanted it, and that he was welcome to come out and work alongside them whenever he liked, not as a hired hand but as a neighbor, and that she would pay him in meals. Bill Garrett looked at her with an expression that was, for him, close to moved, and said that he appreciated the offer, and he took her up on it perhaps twice a month, and those were good days on the farm, with the old foreman's experience and Albert's strength and Irene's management bringing a quality of labor to the land that was better than any of them alone. The country changed around them in the late 1880s as the railroads pushed further, and the towns grew, and the open range that had existed as a kind of lawless commons began to give way to fenced property and county ordinances, and the machinery of a more settled civilization. Albert watched the change with neither enthusiasm nor regret, the way a man watches weather, noting what it means for the practical life rather than having feelings about it. The barbed wire fences that had begun appearing across the Kansas plains meant fewer disputes about grazing rights. The growing town of Hays City meant better access to goods and services, and a school that was improving year by year. The coming of more people meant both the loss of the enormous open solitude of the early Prairie and the growth of a community that supported its members in ways that solitude could not. He and Irene went to church on Sundays when the weather permitted, and knew their neighbors and were known by them, and were regarded, as far as Albert could tell, as a solid and unremarkable couple who farmed well and minded their own business and could be depended upon in a difficulty. He found this reputation satisfying in a way he would not have been able to fully articulate. They were, in the language of the plain, good people. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. In 1888, Thomas was 12 and already thinking about the future of the farm with a seriousness that made Albert slightly bemused, because he had not been seriously thinking about the future of anything at 12. Thomas had begun to read the agricultural publications that Albert subscribed to, particularly the bulletins from the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, which had been publishing research on dry farming techniques and crop rotation that was beginning to change how the more forward-thinking farmers in the region were operating. He brought these to the dinner table and discussed them with the earnestness of a young person who has found a subject that matters to him. Clara, at 10, was quieter about her interests but equally serious. She was a reader primarily, and the collection of books on the shelf had grown considerably since her mother had been the only one reading them. She and Irene had a habit of reading the same books and discussing them in the evenings, and Albert would sit by the stove and listen, and occasionally contribute a word, and the conversation would range from the practical to the philosophical in the way that it does when two curious women with different temperaments are examining the same material. It was in that year, 1888, that Albert made a decision he had been considering for some time. He sat down and wrote his first letter to the Missouri Agricultural Journal, which published occasional pieces about farming practices in different parts of the country. He wrote about the specific challenges and rewards of dry farming on the Kansas Prairie, about the water management techniques they had developed, about the crop rotation that had kept their soil productive through the years. He wrote plainly and carefully, the way he spoke, without embellishment but without leaving anything important out. The editor of the journal published it in the spring edition and wrote asking if he would send further pieces. He showed the letter to Irene and she read it and then looked at him with that expression that was his favorite of all her expressions, the one that was pride and warmth and a kind of tender exasperation at the fact that he was constantly surprising her. "You have been doing this all along and you never told anyone," she said. "I was watching and learning," he said. "I had to have something worth saying before I said it." She shook her head. "Albert." "What?" "You are, without a doubt, the most patient person I have ever known." He thought about the ridge. He thought about 364 nights and the amber eye of the lantern and the year it had taken him to ride down. "I am not patient about the important things," he said. "Not any more." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her, and the children were somewhere outside in the yard, and the October light was coming through the window, and the land was theirs, all those hard-won acres, and the barn was standing, and the root cellar was full, and the lantern was in the south window where she had put it years ago to say, "I am here. Someone is alive and waiting in this house." He had ridden toward it. That was all. He had, after a year of watching and wondering and wanting, finally ridden toward the light, and everything, all of this, the house and the children and the wheat fields and the Sundays and the hands held across the lantern light and the years and the years and the years, had come from that one moment of motion, that single decision to stop watching from a distance and to close the gap. The years after 1888 moved in the way that good years move, with the forward momentum of a life that has found its purpose and is busy living it. Thomas grew into a serious, capable young man who at 15 was already indispensable on the farm, and at 18 was speaking seriously about the agricultural college in Manhattan, which both Albert and Irene encouraged without reservation, because a boy should go where his mind is pointing. Clara at 16 was reading everything she could find and writing letters to the Kansas Women's Christian Temperance Union and to various educational organizations, which her parents observed with interest and, in Albert's case, considerable private pride, though he would not have said so directly because she did not need the encouragement. James and Ruth had a daughter in 1887, a son in 1889, and were building a life on their piece of ground south of Hays City with the same stubbornness and energy that characterized everything James did. Sunday dinners at the homestead had expanded to accommodate them, and the table that Irene had once sat at alone with a tin cup of coffee was surrounded now by people, the talk and laughter of a family that had grown from two people and a lantern in a south-facing window. Bill Garrett died in the winter of 1890 of a heart ailment that had been troubling him for 2 years, quietly in his house in Hays City, which was how he would have wanted it. Albert and Irene attended the funeral, and Albert stood at the graveside in the February cold and thought of all the things Bill Garrett had given him, the land sale, the encouragement that was mostly encoded as bluntness, the trust of 40 acres and a plan for a life. He had not been an easy man, but he had been a good one, and the Prairie had fewer of those than it should. In the spring of 1892, Thomas left for the agricultural college in Manhattan, Kansas, taking the train from Hays City on a bright March morning with a trunk and a list of books to find in the college library, and the particular expression of a young person who is going towards something enormous and knows it. Albert shook his hand on the platform, and Irene hugged him hard, and Clara stood slightly apart looking proud and somewhat bereft. He would come back for summers, and he did, and each summer he came back with new knowledge and new energy and a growing clarity about what he wanted to do with his life, which was to farm this land and farm it better and more sustainably than it had yet been farmed. Albert listened to everything he said with genuine attention and frequently found things worth trying. Clara, in the fall of 1892, began teaching at the Hays City School, having completed her own schooling with distinction, and having been offered a position by the school board, which was looking for local women who could bring both education and stability to the classroom. She rode in on Monday mornings and back on Friday afternoons, reversing the route she had ridden as a child, and on Sunday evenings when she was home, she and Irene sat at the table with the lamp between them and talked and read, and Albert sat by the stove and felt the continuity of it, the way a life builds on itself if you tend it carefully. He and Irene were alone in the house through the school weeks now, for the first time since Thomas was born, and the quiet between them was different from the quiet of the early years, denser and richer, the quiet of two people who have been through enough together to have a shared language that does not always require words. They still sat on the porch steps in the evenings when the weather was good, watching the sky go through its colors. They still drove to Hays City together for supplies and church. They still worked the farm side by side with the easy efficiency that had characterized their labor from the first fence-post morning in October of 1874. She still lit the lantern every night, not in the south window anymore, since the house had been extended and the south-facing room was now the bedroom and not the kitchen. She put it in the kitchen window instead, which faced the yard and the barn and the road, and it burned there every evening from dusk until they went to bed, amber and steady, the same language it had always been, only now the language was not about signaling to the world that someone was alive in here, but about something more particular. It was between the two of them now, a habit that had become a ritual that had become a symbol of everything they had built. The light is on, the house is warm, come home. In the spring of 1893, Thomas came home from the agricultural college for the last time, having completed his studies and having made his decision, which was not surprising but which still moved Albert to hear stated plainly. He stood in the kitchen and told them he was going to come back to the farm, to the homestead that was now 100 acres of well-tended Kansas ground, and he was going to bring what he had learned, and they were going to build it into something that could last another generation. Irene's face did something quiet and enormous while he talked, the face of a woman who has held something together through great difficulty and is watching it become something that will outlast her. Albert shook his son's hand. He said, "There is a lot I can show you and a lot you can show me, and if we do it together, we will probably not drive each other crazy more than 2 or 3 times a season." Thomas laughed. "That is a very reasonable proposal," he said. "I have had practice with proposals," Albert said, and looked at Irene across the kitchen, and she looked back at him, and between them was 20 years and all the weight and warmth of it. Thomas married a young woman named Anna Voss in 1895, the daughter of a German farming family who had come to Kansas in the late 1870s and built a strong operation to the east of Hays City. Anna was 22 to Thomas's 19 years, sensible and capable, and, Irene remarked privately, not at all unlike herself when she had first come to Kansas, which Albert took to mean that she approved. They built a new house on the north end of the property, using the money that Thomas's agricultural scholarship had come with plus the savings he had put away from 2 summers of extra work, and Albert helped with the building as he had helped James with his, and there was a satisfaction in it that had its own particular quality, the satisfaction of a man who has built something good and is watching it continue. The household that had started with 2 people and a lantern in a south window was now, by 1895, spread across a wider geography but knitted together by the regular gravity of Sunday dinners and shared work and the accumulation of ordinary days. James and Ruth were 12 miles south with their children. Clara was in town during the school year and home in the summers. Thomas and Anna were on the north end of the property. And Albert and Irene were in the original house, the one she had kept alone through the long year before he rode down from the ridge, the one where the lantern had burned every night, the one where he had first sat across from her at the table and understood that everything he had been carefully observing from a distance was, in fact, everything he wanted. On an evening in October of 1895, exactly 22 years from the night he had first seen the lantern burning and pulled Calhoun to a stop on the ridge to watch it, Albert Blackwell came in from the barn and found Irene at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between her and a cup of tea, reading, the way she had always read, with her full attention on the page and her hair going silver now at the temples, which he had noticed the way he noticed everything about her. With a particular attentiveness that had not diminished in 22 years, she looked up when he came in and said, "Did you check the east fence?" "I did," he said. "It is fine." I must thought one of the posts might be loose. Thomas was right. I reset it. She went back to her book. He sat down across from her and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had left on the stove, and he looked at her for a moment with the lamp between them and the October darkness outside and the house warm and full of 20 years of accumulated living, and he thought about Calhoun on the ridge, and the amber light in the window, and the year of watching, and the one night he finally rode down. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, without looking up from her book. "The ridge," he said. She did look up then, with a half-smile that was the most recognizable sight in his world. "After all this time," she said. "It started there," he said. She closed her book and set it on the table and folded her hands around her teacup and looked at him in the lamplight, the way she had looked at him the first night he sat at this table, with that clear, direct gaze that had measured the distance between what he said and what he meant and kept finding it negligible. "You were up there for a year," she said, "watching my light." "I was," he said. "What did you see from up there, for all that time?" He thought about it honestly, the way she had always required him to think about things. "A light that said someone was there," he said. "Someone steady, someone worth riding toward." She looked at him across the table, across the lamp, across 20 years of Sundays and harvests and winters and the particular quality of the Kansas light in every season, and her eyes were the same eyes they had been, dark and direct and full of the kind of honesty that required everything of a person and gave everything back. "You should have come down sooner," she said. "I know," he said. "But you came down at the right moment," she said. "You always do." Outside, the prairie was enormous and dark and full of the particular silence of a Kansas October night. And somewhere across the yard the new house where Thomas and Anna lived had a light burning in the window, the same amber warmth against the dark. And in 12 miles, South James had a light on. And in town, Clara was likely sitting at a desk with a lamp beside her. Lights in all directions, each one saying the same thing the first lantern had said, in different rooms and different houses, radiating outward from the point where two people had sat across a table and begun. Irene Hawkins, who was Irene Blackwell now, who had stayed when everyone expected her to go, who had burned her lantern for a year until the man on the ridge had finally ridden down, who had built this life from the ground up with her own hands and his beside hers, reached across the table and put her hand in his the way she had on that November evening in 1874 when he had said what he needed to say and she had said yes. He held it. The lamp burned between them. The prairie outside was wide and dark and cold and impossibly beautiful, the way Thomas Hawkins had once said it was beautiful, the way a hard truth is beautiful, not pretending to be anything other than what it is. Albert Blackwell, who had once spent a year watching a light from a distance and could now not imagine a version of himself that had not ridden down toward it, looked at his wife across the lamp and felt what he had always felt, what had begun on the ridge and had never once, in all the years, diminished. That she was worth every mile of the distance, worth the year of watching, worth the fear and the approaching and the uncertainty, worth absolutely everything that had come before the moment he put his heels to Calhoun and rode toward the light. Worth it, all of it, always.